We are incredibly excited to have George Will today on campus. So our guest was born in Champaign, Illinois. He earned a bachelor's degree at Trinity College in Connecticut, an MA at Oxford, and a PhD at Princeton, and for a time taught at college and the university level. He's a distinguished scholar in the fields of religion, philosophy, politics, and economics, who has brought his extraordinary learning and skill at exposition to help inform and educate a vast audience as a journalist at the highest standard. Perhaps his greatest impact has come from his twice-weekly column in the Washington Post and some 400 other newspapers. These have won him many awards, not the least the Pulitzer Prize, and since the 1970s, he has been a featured commentator on Sunday morning television news panels, and for 3 decades now, he has been a central figure on ABC This Week's show. And as all this was not enough, he is one of the world's leading experts on baseball, and his book, Men at Work, The Craft of Baseball, was a national bestseller. At this point, the rest of this is only anecdotes that Professor Kagan will be able to pull off, and I'm not even going to try at that one. So without any further ado, George Will.
Thank you very much. It's a hostile act to mention that I was a professor. In Washington, we don't think highly of them. There's a wonderful story, true story, in 1976, when Jim Buckley was the incumbent senator from New York, and he was running against Pat Moynihan. And the night they were both nominated by their parties, Jim said, I look forward to running against Professor Moynihan, and I'm sure Professor Moynihan will conduct the kind of high-level campaign you'd expect of a Harvard professor. And they cut back over to Pat's headquarters, and they said, Pat, Jim Buckley's referring to you as Professor Moynihan. And Moynihan pulled himself up to his considerable height and said, oh, the mudslinging has begun. When Bill, my future friend and colleague, ran for mayor of New York in 1965, he was asked at his first press conference, what's the first thing you'll do if elected? And he said, demand a recount. I think Mr. Obama may come to feel that way. And what I want to do today is talk to you a little bit about the condition of Washington and the condition of conservatism and what we really ought to be worrying about, we as conservatives and we as American citizens. I think the basic narrative about Washington today is exactly wrong. The narrative is that Washington is characterized by deep, irreconcilable divisions and that dissent and division is the story. The real story is the consensus that's as broad as the Republic and deep as the Grand Canyon, and the consensus is, both parties subscribe to it, the entire country subscribes to it, that we should have a large, ever-growing, omnipresent, omniprovident welfare state, and we should not pay for it. Everyone's agreed on this. And that's going to explain why we are rapidly going broke. There's a character in the Hemingway's novel, The Sun Also Rises, is asked, how did you go bankrupt? He said, I went bankrupt 2 ways, gradually and then suddenly. We are making a run at that. Milton Friedman always used to say, we're not getting all the government we're paying for, and aren't we glad? Today the story is we're not paying for all the government we're getting, and by giving the American people $10 worth of government and charging them $6.50 for it, we are making big government cheap and popular to our, I think, our long-term sorrow. In fact, I think we are now deep into what can fairly be called the decadence of our democracy. We used to run large deficits for the purpose of building things that it was useful and fair to have part of the cost of which foisted on rising generations. We fought wars to preserve freedom for those coming generations. We built highways, airports, and other infrastructure to serve also the rising generations. But we've gone from running deficits to borrow for the future to now borrowing from the future for the unconsenting unborn who are going to pay for our current consumption. And this is why it seems to me it's time for conservatives to rethink their agenda and to rededicate themselves to an agenda that consists first of defending the intellectual premises and stakes of limited government. The second is to defend the rule of law, which is going to require restoring Congress's primacy within the federal government. And third, restraining the imperial presidency that has evolved under both parties for the last 50 or 60 years. The third is to reassert the relevance of the Constitution as a foundation of a government of limited, because delegated and enumerated powers. And fourth is to reassert the continuing reality of American exceptionalism, which I would like to do, all of which is leading up to, as I will come to in a moment, the fact that we should very much fear the coming of de Tocqueville's prophecy and warning. About, actually 30 years ago exactly this year, I published a book read by dozens called Statecraft as Soulcraft. It was based on the Godkin lectures, which I had given 2 years earlier at Harvard. The subtitle was What Government Does, not what government should do, but what government cannot help but doing. My point was that government, no matter what sort, has an effect on the soul of its citizens. My feeling is that the government we have today is changing the national character, and indeed it is changing the national character as part of the agenda of the current regime in Washington. The multiplying dependencies of the American people on the central government is not an ancillary consequence of this administration's agenda. It is the administration's agenda. To make a majority, and we're already there, by the way, to make an ever larger majority of Americans related to the central government, either as employees or clients. Today we are, as I say, there. I'd like to take a little run. I hesitate to do this in the presence of distinguished political philosophers, but I can't forbear to note that to understand America's argument today, it helps to understand how we got here in America, in the stream of Western political philosophy. And a good place to start this year is with Machiavelli, because this is the 500th anniversary, 2013, of the publication of The Prince. He is generally thought to be one of the markers of the distinction between the ancients and the moderns. The ancients believed that the purpose of the political order, the right political project, was to try and get from people the best that is possible. That is, to get the best leaders possible and the best attributes in the led. That we would have noble politics if we could do this. Machiavelli came along and in the modern manner said, I'm not interested in men as they can be, I'm interested in what they are. And that the political project should be to make the best that can be made of this flawed stuff of humanity. As Kant was to say about 300 years later, nothing straight shall ever be made from the crooked timber of humanity. And Machiavelli and the other moderns said, let's not try. And the Americans are, I think, much in this tradition. Machiavelli was no Democrat, but he was a precursor of democracy because he said, let's have a political order that accommodates the strong, predictable forces that are common to all peoples everywhere. Let's take cognizance of and take our bearings from the great constant of human nature. For 44 years, Machiavelli was a contemporary of another man who was no Democrat in temperament or program, but was a precursor of democracy nonetheless. That would be Luther, because he asserted the primacy of the individual conscience and the unmediated, that is, without a priestly interveners and intermediaries, the unmediated access of the believers to God. This was, of course, all bound up with the translation of the scriptures into the Vulgate, and again, sort of letting loose certain premises that were going to come to fruition in democracy. With Descartes, with Hobbes, we had a kind of democratic epistemology, the beginning of the belief that the great truths in life, the great truths you need to govern your lives and to govern your collectivities, the crucial knowledge can be known by most people. You could even say, and we would in our country eventually say, that the great truths are self-evident, by which our founders meant apparent to minds that are not clouded by superstition. And American politics begins there. And American politics today is very much a continuation of the argument that the founders had and that we've been having ever since. I went to the Princeton Graduate School, and I am convinced that the most important decision taken anywhere about anything in the 20th century was where to locate the Princeton Graduate College. Woodrow Wilson, then president of Princeton, wanted it down on the campus so the graduate students and the undergraduates would be commingled. Dean Andrew Fleming West, his great adversary and tormentor, wanted it where it is, up on the golf course. Woodrow Wilson had one of his characteristic tantrums, resigned as president, went into politics, and ruined the 20th century. I simplify a bit and exaggerate a bit, but the story of American politics today, and for 2 centuries really, has been a rivalry between two Princetonians, James Madison of the great class of 1771 and Thomas Woodrow Wilson of the class of 1879. Madison's contribution to world political theory was a revolution in democratic theory. Before Madison, the very few who had thought democracy was possible or advisable anywhere had agreed that it had to be in a small face-to-face society, the theory being that such a society could be homogeneous and therefore without factions, and factions were putatively the enemy of democracy. So it had to be in a small face-to-face society like Pericles' Athens or Rousseau's Geneva. Madison turned this on its head. He had a catechism. He said, what is the worst outcome in politics? The answer is tyranny. What form of tyranny are democracies prey? Tyranny of the majority. Solution, don't have majorities. Have unstable, shifting majorities, coalitions, unstable coalitions of minorities, so that you don't have a stable and a potentially tyrannical majority. Madison said, in effect, therefore, that everyone had got it wrong, and so he wrote in Federalist 10 that the first business of government is to protect the different and unequal capacities of acquiring property, because these would produce different and unequal factions. And he said famously in Federalist 51, you will see throughout our system the process of supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives. There's a sense in which the United States was founded to be governed and to function politically, even if no one at all had very good motives. So far, so good, as far as I can tell. He wanted Republican remedies for the defects to which republics are prey. He wanted to refine and mitigate public opinion and to make democracy more or less safe. Woodrow Wilson looked upon the founders' project as altogether too cramped and unambitious. He was the first president to criticize the American founding, which he did root and branch. He didn't criticize the founders for marginal matters, but for the very idea of limited government, and particularly the idea of the separation of powers, which made our government hard to be, in one of his phrases, nimble. He said, look, it was all very well to have the Constitution at the time it was written. There were 4 million Americans, 80% of them living within 20 miles of Atlantic tidewater, but now we're big, sprawling country, united by copper wires and steel rails, and we need a unified government for a unified country, and we need, above all, heroic leadership in the presidency. So progress came to be defined early in the progressive tradition as progress up from the founders. If you want a complete introduction to the progressive mind, I suggest you read The Promise of American Life by Herbert Croly. Teddy Roosevelt took it in on his safari. He used to go off and assassinate large animals when he had no other outlet for his bellicosity. And he even took it to Africa and read it there.